This thing was possibly the most coveted card in vintage Yu-Gi-Oh! At the time at which it came out. Hey, what's going on, folks? Welcome back to the Parkside Merchant channel. This is going to be episode number 2 of this series where I go through my top 10 favorite cards from each of the 11 vintage Yu-Gi-Oh! Sets, LOB all the way through Ancient Sanctuary. We just did the LOB video yesterday, so we're going to do the Metal Raiders video today. Metal Raiders happens to be one of my favorite sets, actually. If not, it may actually be my favorite set from the vintage era. A lot of good cards in here, so this was a very hard one to come up with the top 10 for. I was originally going to do like top 15, top 12, because I was having a hard time. But then I was like, nope, I'm just going to do top 10. No honorable mentions. I'm just going to give you the top 10 as I see them. Again, these are not ranked necessarily by playability or by value or by like any specific measure beyond sort of my level of interest in the cards from the perspective of somebody that used to collect and play a lot of these as a kid, and somebody that was a big fan of the original anime series, which has a lot to do with the cards that I remember the most and the ones that I always wanted to have right when I was a kid. So let's go ahead and dive right in to our top 10. So number 10, we have the Thousand Dragon, secret rare from the set. This one clearly to me deserved to be in the top 10. This artwork was obviously very cool to have as a kid. Looked a lot better than the starter deck Joey ones that came along, so this was like the cool version to have. And this was a card that got used a lot in the vintage series. Joey used this card a lot in both the Duelist Kingdom saga, and then later on in Battle City, this also got used, I think, a couple times. So this was almost like an ace card for Joey Wheeler. He obviously had the Red Eyes Black Dragon, but this thing got used a ton. Very fun artwork, very fun combo with the Time Wizard, right, and the Baby Dragon and all that sort of stuff. So I think the secret rare element to it, plus the airtime it got on the show, and just being like a pretty powerful dragon back in the day, this was a cool card. And people that had it in the secret were really cool, right? Way cooler than the people that had them from the starter deck Joey version. This one definitely made the top 10 for me for Metal Raiders. Number 9, I tossed in here the Summoned Skull. I always liked that card. Got a ton of airtime in the show. Yugi used it a lot. People that had the starter deck Yugi would use this card quite a bit because it was kind of useful to have. A nice big monster. Big attack points, right? It was for kids that were playing on the playground. Pretty okay as far as cards go. It was also just a very iconic monster from the series, very familiar, very vintage artwork, and having it here with the this rarity, right, where it had kind of that nice foil shimmer to it, looked a lot nicer than the starter deck Yugi edition of it. So this was also kind of a fun thing to chase for people that were into the card. Okay, next up is Elegant Egotist. I don't know, a lot of folks may not be too interested in this card. I always thought it was kind of fun. It sort of has that nice reflective artwork, right, where you've got the reflections of the Harpy Lady in there, and then it was a card that Mai used a lot during the series. One of my favorite Magic cards from the vintage era was the Harpy's Feather Duster, which I had as a kid, which I think came out of one of the promos, right? It wasn't even part of the 11 sets, which was too bad because it was a really cool card and was basically the banner card or the ace card for My Valentine, who was one of the major characters there during the Duelist Kingdom arc as well as the Battle City narrative. So this was kind of a fun one for Metal Raiders. Very fun, kind of cool looking, rare. And if the Harpy's Feather Duster had been in Metal Raiders, that would absolutely have been in my top 10. But this one gets the top 10 vote since that one's not there. And this was also kind of cool from the My Valentine deck. Next up, we have a Barrel Dragon here. I always liked this monster, right? It's got a very cool artwork, very powerful creature. Bandit Keith, who is the big villain in Season 1, or one of the big villains. I guess Pegasus is really the big villain, but Bandit Keith is presented as a very big villain in the first season. And this is kind of his banner monster, so It was a card that if you had it as a kid, it was a cool card to have. And it was also very powerful. So from that angle, it was also very craveable and desirable as a kid. Um, so yeah, I think the artwork and the importance from the series, along with the fact that it's just kind of a cool, very powerful monster that if you were into machines, this was like a good thing to have. So that definitely makes my top 10 for Metal Raiders. Next up, we have Kuribo. I always got a kick out of the Kuribo card. It's sort of a comical, funny, kind of a gimmicky card in the series. Not very powerful, but it gets a lot of airtime in the show. It's almost as iconic as like some of the real staples because it gets used so much in the series. So for me as a collector, Kuribo, especially this version of it, is a very collectible, important card and deserves to make the top 10 in Metal Raiders for me, just in my opinion. Big card from the series, nice looking artwork with the reflective background, and just kind of a fun, funny looking card, right? From everybody remembers this thing from the vintage series. It's almost sort of like a gremlin, or for people that had Furbies as a kid, if people remember the Furby, like a little animatronic toy that would make sounds and stuff. This thing always reminded me of like the Furbies, and I used to have a couple of Furbies when I was a kid, so this was kind of a fun thing from that angle as well. All right, here come my top 5. Time Wizard gets up there. This is a card you remember, right? You may have forgotten the Baby Dragon, or you forgot Thousand Dragon, or you forgot some of the other things in Joey's deck, but you definitely did not forget about the Time Wizard. This was like the most gimmicky, funny-looking artwork that in the series basically saved Joey from several close calls where he almost got completely destroyed. It was comical how many duels it was, actually. It was almost every duel he used this card, and he had the same exact thing happen, and it always worked out in his favor. So I know it's like you could get this card very easily as a common from the starter deck Joey. Sure, I hear ya. But having it in this rarity with the foil sort of a look to it was always considered, I think, preferable. And it was a big staple back in the day for people that were like Joey Wheeler fans. You had to have this in your collection. Okay, number 4, Change of Heart. Very, very clever artwork here. I mean, one of the best artworks probably from the vintage era in terms of like level of cleverness and level of like thought that probably went into the design here on this one. But it's a very cool looking artwork, very iconic. Kind of a fun card to have in your deck as well, right? It was sort of a fun thing to have back in the day. Had a nice effect, and just to me, right, it's another one of these cards that just stands out when I think vintage Yu-Gi-Oh! This definitely pops up there among a lot of the other things that you would remember if somebody asked you to name several Yu-Gi-Oh! Cards from the vintage era. Okay, next up we have Mirror Force. This is another one of those cards that to me just screams vintage. This thing, and I had a couple of these as a kid. These were like really cool to have because they were really good in your deck, number one, and they were used a lot in the show. It was really hard to pull. It was a really rare card, and it looks amazing. Like it's a very reflective, very basic artwork, but is also very attractive and very interesting to look at. So I think from all those angles, plus it's a trap card, which is fun. There's not a lot of like fun trap cards from the vintage era that people really remember. I mean, this one you really remember. There's a couple others, I guess, but trap cards usually don't get a lot of love in Yu-Gi-Oh! From the vintage era. This one certainly got a lot of attention, and everybody wanted to have this, and everybody still wants to have this card because it's a very hard one to find, actually, in PSA 10. So number 2, Gate Guardian. Now, it's kind of hard for folks. If you remember my video that I did yesterday on the LOB set, and I talked about the Exodia pieces as being some of my favorite cards from that era and from that set. The same kind of thing applies here for the Gate Guardian. And you kind of had to be there to understand why this was such a big deal of a card. Because you look at it and it's like, it's impossible to get it out on the field. It's not really that playable. But back in the day, for like juvenile minds that were playing this game, like kids on a playground, this thing was possibly the most coveted card in vintage Yu-Gi-Oh! At the time at which it came out. And I know people are going to say, well, no, like LOB Blue Eyes and like Exodia were obviously the coveted cards. And yes, that's true, I think, to a degree, but this thing was as desirable and as coveted among people that played Yu-Gi-Oh! Because the stats were so astronomically high, right? With these, I mean, look at the attack and defense, right? It's bigger than a Blue Eyes, it's bigger than a Dark Magician, it's bigger than basically any other monster that existed at the time. And also, it was presented in the narrative in the vintage Yu-Gi-Oh! Series, in that double duel against the Paradox Brothers. They introduced this card as something that was like, this thing is like really, really good. I mean, they presented it, they really hyped it up in the series as like the card that was like the only thing that would defeat Yugi and Joey together, right? It was presented as something that was a big deal, which I think hyped it up even more. And that was a duel that everybody remembered. A lot of memes came out of it, right? It was a very funny episode, series of episodes. I think it was a 3 or 4 episode duel. But, right, I guess when you flash back to 2002, around that time frame, like the Gate Guardian, if you had this thing, and if you had all the pieces to make it, you were a boss. Like, this was a boss card, folks. And I know, like, it's almost useless in hindsight, and it's really hard to summon. But back in the day, especially among people that were young and didn't really know better, like, this looked like the best card in Yu-Gi-Oh! Like, if you had this thing, you were a boss. So take it for what it's worth, but to me, it absolutely is in the top 5 from the Metal Raiders set because it was one of the most coveted cards back in the day. And it's still, to this day, honestly, as a secret rare and a PSA 10, this thing is worth a ton of money. So it's a big card, right? And one that stands out a ton in my mind. Okay, number 1. Anybody who follows my channel would be able to guess that this would be the number 1 card for me. But this card, Garnecia Elephantis, I know people hate this card. And even back then, people hated pulling this thing because there was so much better stuff to get out of the Metal Raiders boxes that everybody wanted. And this was obviously not one of them. And everybody had them also because it was a super. And they were like kind of common. It's like if you opened up enough packs of Metal Raiders, you'd have at least 1 or 2 of these things typically. So I guess for me, I'll put the link above here. I have a full video that talks about why I think this card is underrated and why I feel a very strong level of affinity toward this particular monster. But for me, when I think vintage Yu-Gi-Oh!, this is like one of the cards, top 5. It's an antique, it's an artifact. Metal Raiders is the only set that it was ever printed in. This thing is like the face card of Metal Raiders in my mind. And I know it sounds silly, but maybe it's just because I pulled so many of them as a kid. It's like my association of this card with Metal Raiders is inseparable, right? This is Metal Raiders. This card is Metal Raiders to me. So it's like the Bandit Keith monster. It was only used once in the series in a flashback and never got used again. Nobody even plays this card in the series. Not Merrick, not Kaiba, Joey, nobody. Nobody else ever plays this card in the entire series except Bandit Keith that one time in a flashback, which to me was like always a weird standout sort of a thing as a kid. So there's a lot of reasons why I like the card. Watch the video that I made on it if you want to learn more. But this to me is the number 1 card from Metal Raiders that's my favorite. So that's all, everybody. I hope you enjoyed the video. Let me know what I missed. Let me know what you disagreed with. Let me know how you would reorder or rank what I have here. As always, thanks again for watching. This is the Parkside Merchant channel, and we'll see you next time.